Good afternoon. We'll start with statements from the Secretary General and then the Prime Minister, and following that we'll take a few questions. Secretary General.
Prime Minister Starmer, dear Kir, it is great to see you again, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to NATO headquarters.
Thank you.
The United Kingdom, as you know, has always been a staunch and essential ally. You are one of the founders of our great alliance. RAF pilots help secure Allied skies. The Royal Navy helps keep our seas safe. And the British Army contributes to our shared security. You are world-leading in cyber and innovation. And you make an invaluable contribution to our nuclear deterrent. The UK is also a firm friend to Ukraine. You have provided billions in military and humanitarian aid, vital training, and landmark security guarantees. Going forward, we must not only sustain, but continue to step up our support, so that when the time comes, Ukraine can sit at the negotiating table in a position of strength and pursue a good deal for lasting peace. Our world is increasingly more dangerous. We must be better equipped to meet any threat across all domains, both now and in the future. Russian destabilization campaigns in allied countries are on the rise. They have targeted digital infrastructure, British officials, and even your National Health Service. Just last month, once again, you detected a Russian spy ship in British waters. And you made it clear to Moscow that such brazen acts were simply unacceptable. To stop these attacks once and for all, we need to up our game and make sure our deterrence leaves no room for doubt. We can do this by investing even more in defense. During World War II, factories in the UK and the US produced billions of rounds of ammunition. That was before digitization and automation. With all the might of British manufacturing, just imagine what we could achieve now. The challenges we face are complex. But together in NATO, there's nothing we cannot do. So thank you for your continued leadership and support of our transatlantic alliance. Prime Minister, dear Kir, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's very good to be here. I should say it's very good to be back here. And as you know, the UK's commitment to NATO is stronger than ever because the need for NATO is stronger than ever. And we've had a very good and productive discussion today on how we can meet the rising threats that Russia poses across our continent, including the situation, of course, in Ukraine. Now, a couple of weeks ago, as you know, I was in Kyiv. I saw residential buildings destroyed just days before. I met soldiers in the ICU recovering from really terrible burns. And I met children whose parents are out there now on the front line. And it's yet another reminder that this is a war not just in Ukraine, but a war on Ukraine against those children and their futures. And that's why together we stand with all allies stepping up, particularly in Europe. President Trump has threatened more sanctions on Russia, and it's clear that that's got Putin rattled. We know that he's worried about the state of the Russian economy. So I'm here to work with our European partners on keeping up the pressure, targeting the energy revenues and the companies supplying his missile factories to crush Putin's war machine. Because ultimately, alongside our military support, that is what will bring peace closer. And we must keep working together to bolster NATO. And as you say, things that would have provoked utter outrage just a few years ago have now become almost commonplace. Russian spy ships loitering off the British coast, a campaign of sabotage across Europe, cyber attacks, election interference, and attempted assassinations. Russia is seeking to destabilize our continent and target our values. So we should still be outraged, and we must harden European defence. In the UK, we're proud to be a leading NATO ally, part of the forward land forces, helping to police our skies and patrol our seas. Our defence spending is, of course, 2.3% of GDP now, and we're working hard to set the path to 2.5. And NATO's plans and requirements, as well as the principle of NATO first, will be at the heart of our strategic defence review this year. We can't be commentators when it comes to matters of peace on our continent. We must lead, and that's what I'm determined that we will do. Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, we now have time for a few questions. Third row, Sky.
Thanks very much. Beth Rigby, Sky News. Secretary General, NATO has stood united against Russia with all allies in lockstep since the invasion in 2022. Now 2 members, Canada and US, are on the cusp of a trade war. Do you fear the alliance is unravelling at the most fragile of times? And Prime Minister, President Trump says tariffs on the EU are coming. He hasn't ruled out tariffs on the UK. Are you worried about that? And be it from forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table to threatening trade wars with allies, isn't it the truth that President Trump is a bad thing for Europe's economic prosperity and security? Thank you very much.
On your first question, let me say that I'm absolutely convinced.
Come out of the awful conflict in Ukraine is actually a stronger and bigger NATO, which I think is really important. And as you know, in the Labour Party, we're really proud of the fact that we're a founding member all those years ago in relation to NATO. I think NATO is as important now as it was back then, and it's really important that it's in a stronger position. I think the discussions that we've been having between us today and the discussions I'll have later on this evening are about how we take that forward and strengthen it even further, because there has to be a very strong European element to the defence that we are providing in really difficult times. Thank you.
All right, BBC, second row, please.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. Chris Mason, BBC News. Questions on a similar theme, if I may. Secretary General, what would you say to NATO members currently falling out with each other in public over tariffs? And what's your message to the United States and Denmark as they are feuding over territory? And Prime Minister, would you be willing to water down your reset with the European Union in order to keep President Trump on side? Thank you.
On tariffs, clearly that is not what NATO is about. Maybe I shouldn't comment too much on that, other than saying that when you look at the defense industrial base, it is clearly, it's very clear that the US is selling much more into Europe than Europe is buying from the US. And by the way, collectively, we have to produce much more. There is so much money floating around, and much more will come in because we are spending more. Last year, non-US allies spent 18% more on defense than the year before. So from 2023 to 2024, it was an 18% increase, almost 20%. So we are spending much more. That means more money available for the defense industrial base. And we have to buy it from everywhere. The US has to ramp up, Norway has to ramp up, the UK has to ramp up, the EU, including the big countries like Italy and Spain and Norway, outside the EU, of course, but also, of course, France, and then Turkey. So all these big defense industrial based countries have to ramp up defense production, and there's so much money floating around. And again, what we see clearly is this trade surplus from the US getting into Europe. So there is much more to say to all these numbers than when you look at the, let's say, the aggregate. And on Greenland, I said before,
in relation to the relationship between the UK and the US and the EU, I've always been clear that both are important to us. Now, that for me isn't new. I think that's always been the case and will be the case for many, many years to come. That's why in my discussions with President Trump, we've touched on issues of trade and on issues of security. both really important in relation to the trade that we already do between our two countries, but also the security, the defence and the intelligence partnership that we've founded over many, many years, hugely important to our collective defence. Obviously, I'm here at NATO today, making the clear case and having the discussions about defence and security, and tonight I'll be at the EU Council. Now, tonight is very much obviously about security and defence, where I do think there's a very important discussion to be had about how we increase our security and defence work together in a very volatile world. But also, I will touch on the wider reset, which goes beyond defence and security, into the fields of energy and into trade and the economy. And so, back to where I started, really, both of these relations are very important to us. We are not choosing between them, but that's historically been the position of the UK for many, many decades now.
All right, we have time for one more question. ITV.
Secretary General, these are much more than issues between allies. You have a NATO ally threatening to seize territory from another NATO ally. This is much worse than it's ever been. Isn't it now time that Europe got realistic and started planning for a future of defence that may not include the United States? And Prime Minister, if I may, I know you want to keep a foot in both camps, and I know you don't want to commit here, but you're trying to reset with Europe at exactly the time that President Trump indicates he might be trying to divide and rule in Europe. If he does, and other European leaders ask you, whose side are you on, ours or theirs, what will you say to them?
Well, on your question about NATO and the assumption that you could run NATO without the US, that is for so many reasons a silly thought.
I wasn't assuming.
At least.
European defence without the US.
Yeah, but that means that you have European defence without the US being involved. That's what you're saying. That is a NATO or whatever the organization is then called without the US. For many reasons that will not work. First of all, because we are not, as the Prime Minister was saying, as Kir Starmer was saying, when you look at Ukraine, it is not just Ukraine and Russia, which would be bad enough. It is a geopolitical thing which is going on. The US realizes that, the European side of NATO realizes that. It is China, North Korea, Iran, all getting connected to Russia. So this is a geopolitical, including in the White House.
In relation to the US and the EU, or Europe more generally, if you look at our vital interests, it's really important that we don't, that we work with both and we don't see it as an either-or. On defence and security, we are working very closely with our European allies every day, particularly in Ukraine, but not only in Ukraine, but equally on defence and security with the US and the special relationship in relation to defence, security and, of course, the intelligence capability that we have developed together. This is vitally important. And it is in the best interests of the UK, but also the best interests, I think, in terms of global security and defence, that we continue to work both with the US and with Europe on these vital issues. When it comes to trade, equally, we've got a huge amount of trade between the US and the UK, as we have with the EU, and that's why it's important that I always act in the national interest, the best interests of the UK, as we stay resolute, saying, thank you very much.
All right, that's all we have time for. Thank you.
Of course not.